Well, good afternoon. It's wonderful to be able to see you, and again, it's a privilege for me to be able to share with you this afternoon. Whether you're going to be quite as excited as I am, given what I have to say, we will see, but hopefully it will come together towards the end if you can bear with me. I have to admit, answering this particular question, I feel I may have been given a question that's rather too easy, so I'm going to make it slightly harder for myself. I hope that's okay. Because when you ask the question, is Jesus the God of the West? And I really hope I'm not going to upset anyone now and burst any bubbles. I rather feel like I've been invited to give a talk on, does Santa Claus really exist? The answer is no. Unless your geography is very confused, Jesus is from the East. That's where he was born. That's where he was raised. That's where he lived. That's where he spoke. The three wise men, the three magi who come bearing gifts, the three of the first people on planet Earth to see and recognize Jesus Christ as a king and as a savior who would lay down his life to save others, they came from further east bearing gifts. So God revealed to a whole group of leaders even further east, way further east than Jerusalem, a long, long way away, who Christ was. And they came from the east to come and worship him. The gospel spread further east at a much faster rate than it ever spread west. If we were giving this talk 1,000 years ago, in the West, the complaint would be, why is the intellectual center of Christendom in the East? Because that's where it was in the countries we now refer to as Iraq and Iran and so on. That's where the intellectual center and hub of the Christian faith was. The most exciting scholarship was all being done there. So the answer is no. And I'm not saying that because I spent most of my life being raised in the Middle East. That's just the way it is. So if you were born up thinking of a white Jesus Christ, then no. He would have been brown almost for sure. Blue eyes is a possibility. It can happen. My Greek family all have blue eyes, apart from me, which is still a sore point. But, I think my eyes are deeper and more naturally reflective pools of water than those shallow blue ones. And so in one sense, we could answer this question very simply. The answer is actually at every level, no. As a matter of fact, I think I might go so far to say if you don't understand the context in which Jesus Christ lived and spoke, you'll never truly understand what he said. And if you haven't been to any of the evening talks, do come along and listen to Stephen, who is very much trying to put the words of Christ back into the context in which he spoke them to help those stories that he told, which we're sometimes so familiar with, come alive. So the answer is no. Now, it's even more confusing in Western history because about 1,000 years ago, there was a divide in the sort of the Christian faith between Rome and what was then Constantinople. And so at that point, the West really was on its own and was ignoring what was happening in the East, but there was still a significant and large church from there and that part of the world too. As a matter of fact, the largest number of Christians don't live in the West. There was a book published by an Oxford University professor. It's an OUP publication, as all OUP publications are very reasonably priced at £48 a copy. A book written over 10 years ago. It's an academic study looking at the rise of what's called the Global South and the Christian faith in Asia. By our best guesstimate, and it's hard to be accurate, there are about somewhere between 100 to 150 million Christians living in China alone. It's one of the fastest growing churches in the world. The church is growing faster in the Middle East and Africa, way more than anywhere in Europe or North America or something. So whether you even want to look at it contemporarily and say, well, where's the center of Christian faith in terms of numbers, in terms of strength, in terms of everything else? And the answer is, well, not in the West. It's still not here. Now, that's not to say that God's forgotten the West at all. The guy speaking here in the evening is involved in something called the Alpha Course. I think last year in the UK, 281,000 people did the Alpha Course, which is like what does the Christian faith actually teach? And that's not the only one of its courses, like in the UK. There's another one called Christianity Explored. There's an even bigger program, obviously the largest and most significant, called The Search, which is run right here in Oxford by students here. So if you add all of those numbers together, who knows how many people even just last year, spent a lot of their time asking the question, well, who is Jesus and what does it actually mean? Now, if you do live in the West, interestingly enough, if you live in the UK, statistically, the most likely place you are to become a Christian is actually in prison. which means if you are a Christian and you're concerned about non-Christian friends and you would like to see them become Christians, you may want to consider encouraging them into a life of crime. So basically any job in politics or banking will probably suffice for that. And so it is surprising. So if you were to ask the question, yes, but Michael, you're missing the point of my complaint, surely you're much more likely to become a Christian if you're born in the West, the answer is no. Although maybe if you go to prison, your odds go up slightly, but it's still no. So we have this fascinating wrestle, therefore. How do you begin to deal with this question? And I guess a part of the question, where the question has its strongest legitimacy, would go something like this. The Christian faith has had a huge amount of influence in the West, and that is true. If you're reading English literature or history or philosophy, even if you're studying architecture, if you're ignorant of the Christian faith, of the gospel, of what the Bible actually teaches, you're going to find it very hard to engage at a serious level in any of those academic disciplines, because the impact, the influence has been enormous, it's been huge. I was in Paris a couple of weeks ago, and I was being given a tour around one of the biggest art museums in Paris by one of the curators, a very well-informed lady, and I don't know why it is that English sounds so much better when spoken with a French accent. It just does. And of course, she gave us a tour of the history of European art through one of the world's greatest art museums, and 3/4 of it was theological. This represents this belief, it's a portrait of that, it's an understanding of this. Even as we look at Greek mythology and how that's represented through our art, it's very hard at times also to avoid any of the biblical connections and allusions that sometimes come through that too. It was an amazing lecture and experience. And so what we can say is, yes, what is true is the West has been very heavily influenced by the Christian faith. And now you come to a very interesting dynamic. When I was living in the Middle East, I grew up as a child in Saudi Arabia. When I was living there, I didn't really hear much about the Christian faith at all. You organize a meeting like this in Saudi, that's a crime punishable by death. They remove your head with an axe, so you have very few public Christian meetings. It's a very effective deterrent. They have no repeat offenders, but let's not talk about that kind of thing. When I was there, people would look at Europe, North America, and think, well, look at those Christian countries, look at what a mess they're in. But actually, I guess anyone who lives in the West would think, actually, no, we're pretty secular. We have largely, actually, in many quarters, decided to actually reject God. And that may explain more of the narrative of what we actually see rather than some kind of acceptance of him. So there is this truth that there is a large influence, and we live in Oxford. Almost every college has a chapel. You walk down the streets. If you haven't noticed the spires, then you may want to consider going to Specsavers, because they're everywhere. But this is now when we have a challenge then, when we actually think about Christianity in the West. Because what we have here is tradition. Now, I'm not actually against tradition. In tradition, there's a process, and it's the process that can be dangerous. Because in any tradition, what you have is you have a given reality, and then you have a response to that reality, and then you have a repetition of the response to the reality. But the danger is you end up with repetition, and you've forgotten what the reality is. Now, in the Christian faith, that reality was, first of all, the revelation of the person of Jesus Christ, God come to earth in human form. Then you had a response to the reality. That was also good. That was worship. Then you had a repetition of the response to the reality, and that's what's practiced by many Christians around the world today. The danger is, however, you end up with repetition with no reality, and it's completely dead. I remember the first church I actually went to was in the Middle East. It was a small Anglican cathedral, one of the smallest Anglican cathedrals in the world. And I remember walking into the service, and there was a man at the front wearing a long white dress to the floor, which didn't bother me at all. I was raised in the Middle East, wearing long white robes to the floor, perfectly normal. The thing that struck me as strange is at one point he stood at the front and he held out his arms and he said, "My cup is full and my heart overfloweth. Joy to the Lord." And I didn't believe him, basically. There was no joy to be seen as far as I could detect. And it just didn't feel alive. But in that very same building, in that very same location, I met some other people, and they were so very much alive. I mean, totally transformed. It captivated me. It got me asking all kinds of questions. And I got to meet Christians who were Christians knowing that actually it may cost them their lives. The context where I became a Christian, where I was educated as a Christian, after I decided to become a Christian, Being a Christian meant you could lose your life. So when I became a Christian, there was nothing about it being easy or, wish fulfillment or whatever. There was a cost to it. All the Christians I met were willing to put their lives on the line, quite literally, because of this change that Christ had brought into their life, because of who they knew he was and how they were prepared to live. They were some of the most gentle-spirited, kind, and generous people I've ever met. And it got me thinking in a totally different way about who was Jesus Christ and why did he come. Now, in that sense, there are really only two branches of the Christian faith. I was speaking here in Oxford a couple of years ago, and I had a brief encounter with the mayor, and when they found out I was a Christian, they looked at me and said, "What sect are you part of?" Because you've got all these different Christian denominations. And I said, well, actually, there are only two sects in the Christian faith. And they looked at me like I was crazy and said, "What do you mean by that?" And I said, well, regardless of denomination, that's not really important. There are only two groups, really, within this. There are people who say they are Christian and they have this living, loving relationship with Jesus Christ. And there are people who say they are Christian and they don't have this living, loving relationship with Christ. And you'll find them in every denomination under the sun. But those are the two basic distinctions. I said, and I'm part of that first one, where I'll say it's actually alive. And I remember the mayor just staring at me saying, "I now have so many questions to ask you." I felt like I'd said something wrong. But if you are looking at the Christian faith, and at times it feels confusing, you think, well, I see all these different types of churches and, forms of church and everything else. That's the most basic division I would suggest to you. Is this something which is alive and present and a reality to them now? Or is this just something which they've inherited from the past as part of a tradition, but they wouldn't say that there is that immediate connection? They may even dispute whether it's actually possible. Those are the two basic divisions. Now, therefore, the question, as I say, because I have to speak for 15 to 20 minutes because they gave me free lunch, I now have to make more complicated, because is Jesus just the God of the West? I would like to see expanded, and I can see this is going to go all over the place here. This is great. So let me just try and answer that at a broader level. And the first answer is, Jesus actually claims to be the author of everything. Jesus didn't come into this world saying, "Hey, I own this part of the world." He actually came into this place and said, "Hey, I'm the author of the universe. You see everything you see? It's mine." Now, that's a very bold claim, and it's a crazy claim. If he is not the author of space and time itself, then it would be an utterly ludicrous claim. But that's what he claimed. He says, actually, all of this is mine. He claimed that all human beings, all of us, are all created in the image of God. We're all like him. That's what the Bible says. Jesus talked about the fact that there would be people who would follow him within the geographical region he was in, and also outside of the geographical region. He said, "I have sheep here, I have sheep everywhere, and I need to gather them all to me." I remember being at home when the results of the human genome sequencing came out, and I was fascinated by that story. Not a particularly strong scientist, I was just really interested in it. And there was a simultaneous press conference. I think Bill Clinton was president of the United States at the time, and he was in the White House with all these scientists standing behind him. And then Tony Blair was prime minister of the UK at the time, and he had all kinds of English scientists. And because this was a global collaboration, Bill Clinton was the one who announced, "Hey, we've finally mapped the human genome." And then the guy who'd overseen that project, who himself actually became a Christian as one of the world's leading scientists much later on in life, partly being intrigued by some of the research he was doing, thinking God must be behind this. He gave like a short press statement, and then it zoomed over to 10 Downing Street, and there's Tony Blair saying, "Hey, we were part of this, and we were proud to be part of this, and isn't this great?" And then one of our chief scientific advisors came up, and I don't know what it is about our chief scientific advisor. I seem to remember they were very, very good. It's just that when I learned that the guy who was masterminding this project in the US also drove a Harley Davidson and played jazz music and stuff, it just seemed so much cooler coming from over there than it did over here. But and then of course they had the BBC science correspondents, because that's my favorite channel. I love the BBC. If you were here a few days ago, you'll heard that was the English accent I was brought up in the Middle East, listening to BBC World Service. That's why I sound like this is the voice of the BBC News. I am. That was just my. So, and one of the things that came up really quickly was, as we mapped the human genome, they thought that maybe what we'll discover is different breeding pairs around the world, to explain all the differences between race. And actually what they concluded at that point was actually, no, we all were descended from the same area, possibly this same woman who at that point they were calling mitochondrial leave. And they were talking to each other saying, that's amazing. We're all traced back down to the same source. The amount of genetic variation between human beings is actually tiny. All the differences that we see between our eye shape, skin color, noses, everything else it's a very tiny amount of variation. We have so much in common. This tiny variation creates all of this spread that we see before us of beauty and diversity. And which means, if that's true, if that's actually the correct scientific conclusion, that means if we go back far enough in our family trees, we're actually related somehow. Now, I don't know what the tradition is in your culture, family background, but in where I come from, Middle Eastern background, if you meet long-lost relatives, you give gifts. And I'm just here to say, I'm your long-lost relative, and here I am. Please do come and see me at the end. He's claiming to be the author of the whole show, Jesus Christ, and actually that all of us are created in his image. Now, the picture's even bigger than that. God claims to be the only source of satisfaction for all human beings. There's a fascinating passage in the book of Isaiah. If you have a Bible in your study, you'll certainly have one in your library. I don't know if you'll have one in your room necessarily, but if you want a free Bible, just walk into a church. Most of them are unlocked and take one. They'll have to forgive you for stealing it. They're Christians. That's what they have to do. There's this amazing passage in Isaiah, for example, in chapter 55. It sometimes gets read out at Christmas time, which says, "Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me and eat what is good, and you will delight in the richest of fare." Now, I find this promise from God fascinating. If you notice it, if you read very carefully, God is not questioning the universal human desire to find satisfaction in this world. He's not questioning that at all. He's not saying there's anything wrong with that desire. He's not denying it or minimizing it. But what he is questioning in a very powerful way is, where can it ultimately be found? He's saying, why spend your labor, your effort, on getting things that won't ultimately satisfy you? Why spend your gold, your money, on purchasing things that cannot meet the deepest desires within you? Why do that? That's crazy. Of course, I know we're in a very enlightened room, but I'm sure none of us here shop in order to get relief or build an identity for ourselves. When I was a little boy, when we were growing up, we sewed all of the labels inside our clothes to tell us how to wash them. Now we seem to sew all the labels on the outside of our clothes to tell people who we are. We're sort of trying to build this identity for ourselves. And here, as God speaks, he's saying, look, I'm not questioning this search that you're on. What I'm questioning is, where can it be found? At the heart of the Christian faith is this living, loving relationship with God. That's what's right at the very center of the Christian faith. It's sometimes surprising for people to hear that. They think that joy, this kind of satisfaction, isn't part of the Christian faith. But if you've been coming to the talks in the evening, you would have discovered so far at the end of every talk that the emotion which is described to people becoming Christians, the process of repentance and faith and discovering God, the appropriate emotion which is attached to that is one of joy, it's one of celebration. There's a fascinating little book written by a guy. I used to sit on the board of his organization. The author's name is John Piper, and he wrote this little book called The Dangerous Duty of Delight. And he gives an illustration in there that is actually something that I've often lived by. But it is true that in the Christian faith talks a lot about duty, but it also talks an awful lot about joy as well. And let me try and explain how those two things can actually join together. I do a lot of travel, so I'm often out of the country. I'm away. I was away last week in Southeast Asia. One of the reasons why my voice sounds slightly more Clint Eastwoodish than normal. I'm still getting over the jet lag. Next week I'll be in another country. I'll be over in Africa, and then I'll be back here again, and then I'm disappearing off to North America for a week, and then I'll be back here, and then whatever, which is why I pay to plant trees, because I have to do some kind of carbon offset for my lifestyle. And because I travel a lot, when I come home, that's a special occasion. I want to celebrate it, and I know my wife likes flowers. She's actually here this lunchtime listening to me. It's not the only reason why I'm telling this story. So imagine I've been away for a few weeks, and I'm desperate to see Anne, and I come home, and there's a little florist at the top of my road. I live on a well-known street in Oxford where there's a shark sticking out of my next-door neighbor's roof, and there's a house opposite me called Shark View. Some university students moved into the house next door to that house, and they had an identical sign made that said Shark Better View. So that's where I live. And at the top of the road, there's a little florist. And I sometimes, as I'm coming home, I'll call in at the florist. I'll pick up some flowers. And so when I get home, I knock on the door. And, imagine, my wife, Anne, she opens the door. And as she opens the door, I say, I'm home early. And then I produce the flowers from behind my back. And I go, ta-da, these are for you. And she looks at them and says, Michael, these flowers, they're beautiful. Why did you do it? And I say, it was my duty. There's something profoundly deficient in that answer, isn't there? There was a Christian theologian by the name of Carnell who said, suppose a man came to his wife and said, must I kiss you goodnight each night? Suppose a man came to his wife and said, must I kiss you goodnight each night? What would she say? Carnell said, she would say, unless a spontaneous affection for my person motivates you, your overtures are stripped of moral beauty. Now, personally, I think she'll just give him a slap. But Carnell was a philosophical theologian, so that's what he thinks she would say. What she's saying is, look, if this has got nothing to do with me, if you're not motivated by making some connection with me, this doesn't mean anything. It's a must, but it's not that kind of must. It's a different type of must. You see, there is a duty that comes with joy. There's a type of duty that actually doesn't bring honor to anybody, and it's a duty that's devoid of joy. A duty-bound activity just brings no honor either to your wife or to your country or to anything else, and certainly not to God. But when they're married together. Now, this can be misunderstood, but let me pick up one misunderstanding which is very important, because some people sometimes think, well, if you think about this way in terms of the Christian faith, it makes the Christian faith inherently selfish, doesn't it? And now here we need to be very careful. Let's suppose I've been away, I knock on the door, my wife opens the door, I produce the flowers. Ta-da, these are for you. And she smiles, and she says, Michael, the flowers, they're beautiful. You shouldn't have. Why did you? And I say, because I love you. Because I know how much you love flowers, and I just love seeing the joy when you receive them. As a matter of fact, I've arranged a babysitter tonight. I've booked a table at our favorite restaurant, because there's nothing I would rather do. There is no one I would rather be with, and there's no one I'd rather spend the evening with than you. Now, when I say that to her, she never looks at me and says, what do you mean there's nothing you wouldn't rather do? Why don't you think about me sometime? You're so selfish. The reason she doesn't say that, it is the nature of a loving relationship to delight yourself in the other. There's nothing more honoring in a marriage relationship when what your life says to the person you're married to is, I love you, and I want to be with you. That's honoring. And there is nothing more honoring and glorifying to God when our life says, there's no one I'd rather be with, there's no one I'd rather spend time with, there's no one I'd rather listen to than you. That's not selfish. It may meet one of the deepest needs in our desire, but that's the nature of a living, loving relationship. Do you have that kind of relationship with God? It's right at the very center of the heart of what it means to become a Christian. Jesus Christ is not an idea, he's a person. God incarnate, crucified, raised to life, who offers us relationship with him. And when you meet him, it changes you. And the reason you change is not because you have to, it's because you want to. You want to spend time with them. God doesn't question this search that we're on, this search that all of us are on, and regardless of what part of the world you're from, for intimacy, for fulfillment, for satisfaction. What he questions very strongly is where this is ultimately found. And if you're looking for it in this world, in any person or anything, it's going to disappoint. No one can be God to you apart from God. Now, Jesus Christ also claims ultimately to be the only source of redemption. Now, I wish I had time to go into this into so much more detail, but let me just say two things. If you keep reading in that passage in Isaiah 55, you'll come to some other words where it says, seek the Lord when he may be found, call on him when he is near. Let the wicked forsake their way, let the righteous their wicked thoughts, let them turn to the Lord, and he will have mercy on them, and to our God who will freely pardon. So this is a very encouraging passage which follows immediately on that about our search for satisfaction, and it says, hey, when God is near to you, draw near to him. He will forgive you, he will pardon you, you'll find relationship with him, and you can be with him. Now that's nice. But there's a condition. I don't know if you heard it at the beginning. When God is near, this is what you should do. So the next logical question will be, well, when is God near then? And then that is answered actually in the next few verses. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, So are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. So what does that mean? When God is near, come near to him. He will draw near to you. He will forgive you. He will pardon you. He'll draw you into this relationship, and you will be satisfied, and your soul will delight in the richest affair. Great. How near is he? Well, as far as the heaven is from the earth, and that's a long way. I mean, that's a seriously long way. There was a story told about two Cambridge University students sitting out looking over the river. It's dark, starry-filled sky. They can see the moon. One says to the other, I wonder what's further away from here, Oxford or the moon? And the other Cambridge University said, duh, can you see Oxford from here? So this is a long distance, right? As far as the heavens are above, this is a big gap. So the answer is, God, he's not near. And that's not such good news, is it? But then if you keep reading through Isaiah 55, this is what it says. But as rain and snow come down from heaven to the earth, so is the word that comes from my mouth, from the heaven to the earth, and it will achieve everything I have set for it. Well, what is this word meant to bring? And the answer is, well, forgiveness, pardon, relationship with God, satisfaction. So now it is answering the question. You cannot get to me, God is saying, but I will send my word from heaven to earth. That's when I'm near. I will draw you to me. And as I draw you, if you say yes to me, you can receive mercy and pardon. You can find this relationship. In other words, God is promising here not to simply be the source of redemption, of satisfaction, but also redemption. He can fix what has gone wrong. So when Jesus Christ claimed to be the source of all living water which you drink from and you'll never cease to be satisfied, when he claimed to be the only one who could draw us to God, when he said, I had longed to gather you to me, but you need to be willing. As people listened to Jesus say these things, they understood one thing. He is now claiming to be the word from God who came from heaven to earth to bring about this pardon, this forgiveness, this satisfaction. He will do it. And if we say yes to him, we can be with him. I'm wondering if you know that in your life. God, Jesus Christ, is not simply the God of the West, even though he has spoken to the West and does speak to the West today. He is God of the whole show. He claims to invent everything, create everything, to be the author of everything. He claims to be the only one with whom we can truly find satisfaction and the only means by which we may find redemption. Now, there's one other aspect to this question which I'm going to leave till answering tomorrow when we talk about Jesus the only way. Because there's one other fundamental universal struggle all human beings face, and it's the question of identity. Who am I? How do I answer the question as to who I am and my ultimate worth? And again, it doesn't matter what culture you're in, we all wrestle with it. I'm going to deal with that tomorrow. But for the purposes of today, the question remains, do you know who he truly is? It changes everything. He's influenced the West, but we've largely forgotten him. In many places we have the tradition without the reality. There is a huge need to discover afresh that reality with Christ, which he actually makes possible for us to find. The last two nights, Stephen has spoken out of Luke 15. So let me just end by one final observation. If you're sat near downstairs or if you're sat upstairs, you should have one of these under your seat. And you'll find Luke chapter 15 on page 106 of this little book called Uncover, in which there are QR codes. And after Jesus tells the parable of the lost sheep, which Stephen spoke on the first night, and then the parable about the two lost sons, as Stephen correctly pointed out, there's a little bit in between that let me just make a few comments about. Jesus says, look, suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin. In the same way, I tell you, there is more rejoicing in the presence of angels of God over one sinner who repents. Now, these words of Jesus Christ are fascinating. What Jesus is saying is, because he's speaking of himself, as Stephen pointed out if you were here for the past 2 evenings, Jesus is saying, look, we are lost. Human beings, we've just lost connection with the author of space and time. And it's not so much that we're looking for him, he actually looks for us. The saving figure in this little story, she pays the price. She sweeps the floor, she lights the lamp, she makes the search, she carries the burden of restoration, she finds the coin, she brings it back. And that which is lost is now found. And this process of events is what Christians understand by the gospel. That God cares for us. He searches for us. He looks for us. He pays the price. He comes to us. He carries the burden of restoration. That's why Jesus Christ, he goes to the cross. He pays the price for what we have done wrong. And he offers us forgiveness as a gift. And if you receive it, you're found. You're with him. Now, this raises one last question, which I'm going to deal with very briefly, and then I'm going to offer just a short time for response, which is to do with arrogance, which I can fully also understand. Christianity is sometimes understood to be arrogant, and the West is sometimes understood to be arrogant. I want to separate those two things out. I'm not interested in the political arrogance of the West, although it's undoubtedly the case that very often we are. But if you understand Christianity to be arrogant, then you've missed a very vital point. So let me try to illustrate it this way. Let's supposing from the platform I were to make fun of Stephen Foster, who's been speaking in the evening, absolutely brilliantly, by the way. And I were to say he is an idiot, a moron, a fool. I insult him, his family, his mother, people connected to him, the church he's part of, and even the car he drives. And for some reason, he finds that offensive. Okay? You're sitting here thinking, wow, there seems to be a little bit of rivalry between the two speakers, the you invited in, and you come back the next lunchtime, and here I am, you come here early, you see me all on my own, and you say to me, Michael, I was here yesterday. That was a very interesting way you closed out your talk yesterday. How's the relationship between you and Stephen? And I say to you, he's the closest friend I have. There is no one on this planet to whom I am closer than him. Now, if that was my response to you, you would look at me and think, Michael Ramsden must have the intellectual and emotional intelligence of a carrot to believe that is true. But let's suppose, as you talk to me, you hear that after you all left today, Stephen sat me down, he took me out for dinner. After he finished talking this evening, he invited me out for a coffee. He spent all through the morning, he didn't even go to sleep, talking to me. And he makes it very clear that even though I've insulted him, rejected him, slandered him, made up accusations which aren't true about him, he wants to forgive me. And as he extends that grace and that love to me, I simply break down and I say, Stephen, I can't believe I made those things up about you. I can't believe I brought all those false accusations. I am so sorry. And as I say those words, I am so sorry, I receive the forgiveness he's offering to me. And he continues to talk with me with his arm around me. As a matter of fact, he only left 5 minutes before you came in. And when you come to me and you say, Michael, what's your relationship with Stephen? And I say, he is the closest friend I have in this world. I'm not closer to anyone than him. There isn't a single ounce of arrogance in that statement, is there? Because it's got nothing to do with me. It's all about him. Does that make sense? When Christians talk about knowing God and having this relationship with God, it's not some kind of arrogance, I've figured this all out. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite of arrogance. It's inherently humbling. It's saying, look, God has made this possible. He is searching for all of us. He has paid the price for our forgiveness on the cross, even before we thought of asking for it. He has risen to the dead, and he's offering me this new life in him. He has paid for everything. He is just offering me a way, and then all I need to do is say yes. And that's it. It's one of the most humbling things in the world. And it's been my joy to meet people in the Middle East, right across Africa, Asia, everywhere, all over the world, who found that peace and that union with him. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Where do you find your ultimate satisfaction from? What are you spending your labor, your time, and your gold, your money on? Is it capable of doing what you need it to do? Do you know this kind of peace and forgiveness? Christ is both the author and the creator and also the Redeemer and the one who's made it possible for us to know him, and he offers himself to us.